Second World War was the fire in which armored warfare was baptized. Yes, tanks and other armored vehicles trudged through the mud and blood of France in the First World War, but nobody really knew how best to use these weapons or how to kill them. The First World War had given birth to anti-tank rifles, but by the time of the Second, these weapons had become less and less effective as armor thicknesses increased. Instead, artillery pieces and field guns started pointing at the horizon, and it wasn't long before somebody decided to try making these things more mobile by strapping them to, well, whatever they could. The Chieftain has a wonderful video on the US development of tank destroyers showing some of the wacky ways people tried to build these things, and I will be pulling from it pretty heavily. The US first entered the TD game with the M3 Gun Motor Carriage being an M3 Halftrack fitted with the model 1897 75mm gun. It was a logical next step to take a bigger gun and stick it on the M3 GMC, but the bigger gun they had in mind, the 3-inch M7, was too big to fit the Halftrack. The M4 Sherman had proved to be a reliable and versatile platform, so it was soon fitted with a new open-topped turret capable of mounting the 3-inch M7 and dubbed the 3-inch Gun Motor Carriage M10. The M10 served admirably from 1943 on until the German big cats showed up and scared the higher-ups. The M10 could actually take on Panthers respectively, with the 899th Battalion destroying a fair number in July 1944, but the appearance of heavy tanks shook the anti-tank branch enough to request all M10s be replaced with the subject of today's video, the M36 Tank Destroyer, also known as Jackson. The kit on the table is something of an antique, a Fujimi M36 Jackson from around 1988, itself a reboxing of a Nito model from 1975. Fujimi Mokei is a Japanese model company from Shizuoka and has been around since the end of World War II. Like most Japanese model companies, they don't focus specifically on military subjects, often branching off into civilian automobiles and, in Fujimi's case, other things. Anyway, it's probably about time to get started on this one, so let's get to it. The lower hull comes in 4 parts: the walls, floor plate, and rear. The side walls have the bogies molded in place already, but I'll cover those later. The rear plate has the exhaust pipes and deflector molded in, and they look okay for being a single piece. It's too bad they'll be covered up entirely by the rear deck. The differential cover is the one-piece casting appropriate for late war Shermans, but maybe a little too round. The bolt strip should have recessed and counterbore bolt heads, as most late war Shermans did, but given the Lilliputian scale of the kit, I'll forgive them for going with fully exposed bolt heads. However, I won't forgive them for making the bolt strip far too tall, nor for mounting the tow hooks way too high. What's incredibly surprising about this model is how it includes an interior. Normally, a model this size will include the inside firewall, but Fujimi have gone ahead and added the engine too. In fact, this pocket-sized tank from 30 years ago has more of an interior than either of my larger Tamiya tanks from this century. The engine in all M36s and M36B1s was a Ford GAA V8 gasoline-powered engine capable of 450 horsepower at 2600 RPM. This gave the Jackson a respectable top speed of just shy of 30 miles per hour. If you want to know more than you've ever wanted to know about the Ford GAA, shoot on over to the Sherman tank site where these amazing graphics came from. Anyway, if we compare the plastic to the steel, we can see that the detail isn't incredible, but it's still a lot more than what I was expecting, especially given the quality of the rest of the kit. Moving forward into the fighting compartment, we have the prop shaft shroud leading into the driver's gear shift, then to the transmission. The transmission modeled here is pretty square, quite dissimilar to the actual transmission present in Shermans and Jacksons. The transmission itself was a synchromesh with 5 speeds in forward and 1 in reverse. On the port and starboard side of the gearbox are the driver's seat and assistant driver's seat respectively. The driver has his 2 steering tillers and 2 adorable little nubs that I assume are meant to represent the accelerator and clutch. The kit includes a driver, but I've decided against using any of the included figures. The assistant driver's position is incredibly simple, but we'll touch on that later. The floor plate has 4 doors that hold additional ammunition for the 90mm gun up top, but it's difficult to find pictures of the interior, so I can't speak to the layout. For what it's worth, the Chieftain surmises it's a half basket on the starboard side, so I cut the plate in half. Moving on to the upper hull, we have the characteristic sloped sides of the M10 and M36. The upper hull is molded in one piece, so there's not much construction required on my end. There's a small amount of flash on the thinner edges, but it's nothing too bad. Starting on the top, we have the two hatches for the driver and assistant driver just forward of the very pronounced turret ring. Just aft of the ring are the 5 armored filler caps surrounding the 2 engine access hatches. These 4 caps on the outside are for gasoline. The pairs are just above each of the fuel tanks, which hold a combined 192 gallons. This one just off center is for lubricating oil, while this square doodad here is the external fire extinguisher handle. Rounding out the upper hull is the rear plate where most of the Pioneer tools are located. Fujimi has already molded them in place, so all we need to do is glue the travel lock or gun cradle into the mounting horns. The travel lock was fitted in one of 2 locations on the vehicle, either in the back as shown here or in front. Crews understandably felt more comfortable with their gun locked to the front, so a few vehicles can be seen with field modifications that locked the gun to the 12 o'clock position. On the opposite end of the hull is the front glacis. On the 2 edges are the headlights, brush guards, siren, and lifting hooks. On the front end we have the fenders, square and hinged. This appears to be the most common fender shape, with the Sherman-style rounded fenders being seen less often. This typo negative logo tucked in the corner is the driver's second periscope. Normally canted off at 45 degrees, but modeled here as being straight ahead. The front glacis includes one odd feature, this mount for a caliber 30 Browning machine gun. The only variant of Jackson that included a bow-mounted machine gun was the B1, which was a Sherman M4A3 hull fitted with the turret of an M36. As we can clearly see, this is not an A3 hull, making the inclusion of the machine gun anachronistic. Because the interior will be somewhat visible but impossible to access when the model is assembled, I go ahead and prime and paint the interior. All US fighting vehicles are painted white inside, so I spray some Tamiya XF2 out of my Pasha H. I do some detail painting before I seal it with a light clear coat. Once that's dry, I do some dry brushing and an oil wash. The turret of the Jackson had a distinctive shape thanks to its lengthy bustle. The sides of the turret were rolled steel plate 1.25 inches thick, while the bustle was a massive cast counterweight with thicknesses anywhere from 1/3 of an inch on top to 5 inches in the rear. The kit doesn't have any weld marks or casting texture, though the seam line between the two will serve as a good place to start. Up front is the vehicle's primary armament, the 90mm gun M3. The gun is mounted in the M4 T8, which when fitted gives the gun 10 degrees of depression. The mantlet is quite wide, with the lifting horns placed on the extreme edges. Unsurprisingly, I managed to snap off one of these guys, so I decided to replace both with horns made of steel wire. These triangular wings, while present on the real steel, are nowhere near as pronounced as they are on the model. This hole is so small as to be almost missed. It's the bore for the M76F scope. Ordinarily, the gunner would also be equipped with a periscope, but seeing as how there isn't a roof to get in the way, it's safe to say he doesn't need one. The barrel itself is another anachronism. It appears to have a bore evacuator and muzzle brake taken from when the vehicles were modernized for post-war service. You'll notice in a few pictures the muzzle has a difference of diameters. This is where a muzzle brake would be fitted, but one was not provided. I've decided to do away with the whole thing and replace it with a brass tube I've had lying around. The tank's secondary armament, a caliber 50 M2 Browning, is mounted in the center of the bustle atop this pedestal. This little dingus hanging off the back is part of the contraption that holds the weapon when disassembled. Quite clearly missing is the rest of the contraption. While not super high quality, this image from a handbook shows how that would have looked. Being built on a modified Sherman chassis, what we find supporting the tank should surprise no one. 3 pairs of bogies with a pair of rubber-tired road wheels each. Fujimi could easily have modeled the road wheels as disc-shaped, but they've gone to the extra trouble of making them 5-spoked. The track guides look to my eye a little large, and the return rollers are barely present at all. The track is modeled in a metallic gray material, probably vinyl, with this odd metallic green on the ends. The greenish material is significantly more brittle, so I won't be rolling this one across the floor anytime soon. I would guess that the pads are meant to be rubber T48s. The guide horns are minuscule, and there are these wide tabs off to the side which I can only assume are grousers. The drive sprocket, modeled after the more complex version, has 12 teeth when it should have 13. I say 12, but it's attached to the sprue in such a way that cutting it free will destroy 2 of them. Additionally, the mounting hubs have 12 bolts when the Sherman family only used 8. They have included track racks on either side which hold 3 spare links each. If you compare the spare tracks to the vinyl, you'll see that they're nowhere near the same size. Fujimi have included details on the underside of the tank where others have not. Most prominently are these large doors giving access to the crankcase and 4 drain cover plates. I really wish the rest of the model had been made with this level of care. I primed the pieces separately with my favorite Rust-Oleum Painter's Touch Gray. After that I used Tamiya's XF58 lightened pretty heavily with XF2. I do this to preserve the scale of the model. Lighting is pretty complicated and I barely understand it to begin with, so I'm not going to go into it here. The tracks are painted with Vallejo track primer. Given how rubbery and cheap the tracks feel, I'm quite surprised with how well they take paint. This kit includes a motorcycle, ostensibly a Harley Davidson, but I don't care. These bulges around the upper slope are bosses meant to fit additional armor for the M10. The thinking was that additional armor would be manufactured and bolted on when needed, and so was carried over on the M36, but those pieces ended up never being made. Instead, the Grouser racks were moved from the N10's bustle to the bosses on the rear. Interestingly, the bosses on the sponsons were removed mid-production, so you'll find a few photos of both vehicles without them. This section of the build was very frustrating, as a lot of the parts lack locating features and the manual just hand waves you in a vague direction. I used my reference photos a lot for this, but I still don't know if I got it right. The tracks don't fit. I have no idea how this happened. At first, I thought they shrank, possibly explaining why they're smaller than the spare tracks spowed on the sponson, but they still fit the drive sprocket just fine. According to the manual, they're supposed to be glued at the end as per usual rubber band tracks, but I avoided doing that because there's no way they would have fit on the tank. Instead, I wrap them as tightly as I can around the running gear and just glue them in place with whatever I have handy. The kit includes markings for two vehicles, one from the 3rd Armored Division, 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, the other from the 5th Armored Division, 701st Tank Destroyer Battalion. Both of these markings have issues. From what I can tell, the 705th was never attached to the 3rd Armored Division, and they never used Jacksons. Instead, they spent the Battle of the Bulge attached to the 101st Airborne, armed to the teeth with M18 Hellcats and a few antiquated M10s. The 701st Tank Destroyer Battalion spent the war attached to the 1st Armored Division in Italy, not the 5th in the Fillet Gap, and they were only equipped with M10s. I just use the stars and stick them in a few areas I can see on period photos. You can tell that it's common to omit unit markings, so I don't use those either. After soaking in warm water, I slide them into position and cement them with decal solution. They're a little thick for this scale, but it could be a lot worse. I clear coat over all of them with Tamiya XF86 to protect them from the next few steps. I think I'll keep these triangles and use them for something else in the future. I really like the skull and crossbones, but I can't find any real-world examples of it. If you're curious, the bottom text says 15.5 Canona, which was a common designation for various foreign-made 155mm guns. So normally at this point, I'd attack the model with pigments and oil washes, but I've decided I want to try a winter whitewash. In the field, these were hastily applied with whatever paint was available. For modeling, this will usually be done by applying hairspray or chipping fluid on top of the previous clear coat, and then using a white paint of your choice. However, I've seen a few brands selling washable or reactivatable paints for this purpose, and decided that it might not be too difficult to reproduce. After some experimenting, I found that mixing washable tempera paint with Tamiya paint in a 1-to-1 ratio yields a paint that can be effectively chipped. Keep in mind, tempera paint is incredibly grainy, so it will spit a lot, plus it has a drying time roughly equivalent to the half-life of uranium-235. Set it aside to dry and give your airbrush a deep cleaning. So I have a note that only occurred to me when I was in editing, and that is that when I was doing the experimenting with the homemade whitewash, I was applying it with a brush, so the thickness of the paint doesn't really matter when you're brush painting. However, I find that Tamiya straight out of the jar is already a little too thick for my airbrush preferences, and throwing in the tempera didn't help things, so I thinned it with alcohol and ended up getting roughly a 1-to-1-to-1 ratio, which effectively gave me a 2-to-1 ratio of alcohol-based paint to water-based paint. And so when it came time to actually do the chipping, I found it was a lot harder to remove the paint than when I did the testing. To chip the paint, you just grab a stiff brush and rub some water on the areas you'd like to chip. Once I'm happy with the result, I do another oil wash and pick out some of the edges with a graphite pencil. Finally, since I'll be placing this on a diorama, I mix up enough of the mud color to slather on the vehicle. I use a frayed brush and a bit of sponge to coat the tracks and running gear, plus add a bit of splashed mud on the fenders and sponsons. And so that's the kit. Given what I've previously said, what with the vague instructions, ubiquitous presence of flash, and magical shrinking tracks, you might be under the impression that it's a poor kit or that I hate it. Far from it. Given our modern standards, this kit is undeniably antiquated and could do with a load of modernization, but in my experience, this kit is about average for kits made in the 70s. There are a lot of things, interior detailing chief among them, that stand out to me as this being made by a company or model maker who had a lot of big ideas and wanted to accomplish a lot, but lacked either the resources, technology, or talent to pull it off. Which honestly sounds like a microcosm for my life. Further, Fujimi are still around and seem to be thriving alongside their Shizuoka counterparts, with a lot of interesting nature or automotive models and even branching into branded merchandise. I would love to try another kit from this company as soon as I get this shelf emptied a bit. Alright, so that was the video on the Fujimi M36 Jackson. If you guys enjoyed that, hit that subscribe button. Or don't. I don't control you. There's a hair on the microphone. Got it. If you noticed I used any of your pictures or your videos without attributing you, please let me know. I'll be sure to credit you. I suppose I should say, just for the record, that I was not paid to do this. Nobody told me what to say. I bought this. I bought everything here and here with my own money. So, yeah, everything here is my own. You know, I really should script these. So if y'all have any neat information about the M36, or was there something I missed, if you've got any questions, drop them in the comments, or follow me on Twitter. And thank you to these wonderful people that should be scrolling by over there, I think. I think that's all I got. Baby tank.